I want to start out by playing something for you from Dan Tarullo, somebody whom you know well. We talked to him a few months ago while he was still on the Fed about the need for possibly cutting back on some regulation. This is what he had to say. I want your reaction.
We can do a lot, I think, to play with, to dial down some of the regs as they affect smaller banks and even large regional banks like BB&T or U.S. Bank, which have big balance sheets and do an enormous amount of lending. When we talk, though, about those 8 largest systemically important institutions, troubles at any one of which could pose a risk to the financial system, I think it's there where we want an extra margin of safety, and there where we need to keep the capital levels up.
So, Sheila, as you know well, Dan was identified with a lot of the regulatory push after the great financial crisis. And there's Dan saying, look, we really have to focus on those big banks, but in fact, there's a fair amount we could do to trim back on the regulation for the smaller banks, the regional banks, the community banks. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, I do agree with him. I think we cast the net too wide. And the problem was it really diluted some of the focus on those 8 largest truly systemic entities he was talking about. Because, you know, you kind of have to water things down if you make the enhanced prudential standards applicable to the smaller regional banks as well. And they are not systemic in the sense that if one of them failed, it would not cause a broader economic disruption. That's really the test of whether they're systemic or not and need that enhanced oversight, the living will process, the resolution planning. That's what we need, where we need to focus. And so by looking too broadly, I think we did dilute the focus on those institutions, which is really where regulators really need to be spending a lot of time.
So as we look at what the so-called Crapo bill that's pending right now, the Senate version of this, it does a fair amount of that trimming back on the local, the community. Do you agree with the Crapo bill? Are there issues that you have with it?
Well, I do have issues with them because I'm fully supportive of most, not all, but most of the relief for the smaller regionals and the community banks. But there are a couple of little juicy tidbits for the very large institutions as well. One, I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago on this. It significantly dilutes the what's something that's called the supplemental leverage ratio, which is a very key constraint on the use of excessive leverage by very large financial institutions. And so supposedly it's just limited to 2 or 3 custodial banks who should not get capital relief. They're highly systemic. They should be having nice thick cushions of capital. But the Senate Banking Committee also amended the language so it could apply and benefit Citigroup and JP Chase too. So that has nothing to do with small banks and regional banks. I think it's disingenuous for it to be in the bill. Senators who are supporting this bill, who are out there saying this just helps the smaller institutions, that's not right. There's a provision that could significantly weaken large bank capital standards and should be deleted. And I hope that that happens as part of the ongoing process. It's probably unlikely, but I hope it is.
Sheila, I want to understand this because, as you say, the provisions in the bill were said to be directed at a handful, really like 3 or so custodial banks. If, in fact, it could be modified so it's clear it only applies to them, didn't apply to Citigroup, didn't apply to Bank of America, would you at that point think that's a sensible way to approach it?
I don't think that's sensible. I think the custodial banks are also highly systemic. They need the cushions of capital. We need them to be highly resilient during a crisis. It may be appropriate to provide them capital relief if we get into a downturn where we want to give them extra capacity to expand their balance sheet. But to do it now when times are good, they're making money, they all just got a big tax cut, to direct the regulators to reduce capital now in the good times, which will reduce the cushions they have in the bad times when we do want them to be able to expand their balance sheets, is just nonsensical. So no, I think it's a bad provision, period. But I would feel better about it if it was confined to just those 2 or 3 custodial banks. The House bill, actually, I think there's a perception that the House bill is more deregulatory than the Senate bill, and in some respects it is. But on this, actually, the House bill had a much more limited provision, which again was expanded in the Senate Banking Committee.
Sheila, what about a reproposed vocal rule, especially as it winds up hitting some of the regionals like U.S. Bancorp, BB&T, et cetera? What's a reasonable shift there?
So, yeah, I think the treatment of the Volcker rule is appropriate. Paul Volcker is generally supportive. He had suggested in a letter, and I also agree with this, that there still be, though they shouldn't have the smaller banks, the less than $10 billion, and those that have a small percentage of trading assets, that they should not have to comply with the Volcker rule. But supervisors, examiners, when they go into those banks, should also still have some latitude to make sure, just to double check to make sure there's no gaming, that there's no proprietary trading going on. So I think that would be a sensible modification. But overall, I think, the Volcker rule, they trimmed that back a bit in the Senate Banking Committee. They went in the right direction in the committee there. And so I think overall that's probably a sensible approach.
Sheila, as you know so very well, it's not just what the law says or the regulations say, it's also who's applying the law and the regulations. We've had some changes now at the Fed. We've got Randy Quarles in as the new vice chair for regulation. We just yesterday heard about Mr. Williams coming to the New York Fed. What do you make of the team that's coming in?
Yeah. Well, we're not sure yet. I mean, I think the Fed's been, kind of signaled it's okay with this bill, which I find disappointing because I think they're right on the relief for the regional and the community banks, but not on the supplemental leverage ratio for the big banks. So that gives me a bit of cause of concern. There have been no major changes in the regulations so far, so I will keep my fingers crossed that there's no serious weakening. But we really just don't know yet. And there's a lot of vacancies still to fill on the board, and then very key slots like the New York Fed president looks like it's going to be filled by an insider who has been John Williams, who has been heading the San Francisco Fed. So that was a little disappointing to me too. I think there were some really good women candidates. I was hoping they would bring in a woman and kind of break that white male tradition. Nothing against white males, but there's some really good, well-qualified females as well. So that was disappointing. My view for the New York Fed, they really need someone with some supervisory credentials and someone who understands bond markets. And they had two really good women candidates, Sarah Bloom Raskin, who was a very tough regulator, served on the board. Then Mary Miller also, very deep experience with the bond markets. Both of them would have been excellent. And, to have to say the Fed needs another monetary economist, that's like saying, Washington needs more lobbyists. They've got a slew of economists at the Fed already. I'm not sure why that was a key factor, especially when the New York Fed, given their important supervisory and open market operations responsibilities. It seems that's where they should have been looking.